Might start now. Order. Esther McVeigh to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered the impact of planned changes to employers' national insurance contribution on police forces. I may say it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak on this important issue. And I rise today to address a matter of significant concern, one that will affect police forces in my own constituency of Tatton and right across the countries. Members will be aware of the broader tax and fiscal challenges presented by this government in the autumn budget last year, changes to things like the agricultural property relief and also the cruel cutting of the winter fuel payment, which have rightly been widely condemned and which I've objected to many times in this House. In fact, last night, in this House, in this chamber, it was absolutely jam-packed with members from across the House condemning this government's family farm tax. People were sat on the ledges here trying to speak, but some of them were not able to speak. Such was the feeling against some of the disastrous consequences of the budget. I won't just please allow me to make the case, and then I will come back to the honourable gentleman. So we know about the removal of the winter fuel payment from nearly 10 million pensioners. We know about the farmers' tax, the family farm tax. We know about the VAT on private schools. All have received much attention in this House. But we must not overlook how wide the ramifications were of that autumn budget, particularly the changes to the employer's national insurance contribution. The devastating impacts that will have on individual employers and businesses, but something that has been widely overlooked has also going to be the impact it will have on our treasured public services. And I would like to focus my comments today specifically on the impact of our police forces. Now, Madam Chair, you will be wondering, how does the member of Tatton know what's going to happen here? Did the Treasury conduct an impact assessment? Did the Chancellor so generously share the assessment with members from across the House? Were police forces consulted on such changes? The answer to all these questions is no, as is often the case with this government's policy announcement. So late last year, I submitted freedom of information requests to every police force across the United Kingdom, asking for the expected additional costs that each police force will incur owing to the Chancellor's hike in employers' national insurance contributions. And I was shocked, yet unsurprised, to learn of the devastating impact that this policy will have on our police forces. So in my county of Cheshire, the local constabulary will now face an additional £3.7 million per year in employers' national insurance costs. I will indeed give way.
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for. Thank you. I thank my right honourable friend for giving way and for securing this debate. She is making an excellent speech, as always. My right honourable friend and I are both Cheshire MPs, and we are fortunate to work with the Cheshire Constabulary, who are one of the best forces in the country. However, like me, she will know the challenges that Cheshire Police face in the area of rural crime. Given the changes to employers' national insurance contributions, as she says, are estimated to be costing the force £3.7 million, does she share my concern that this could have a significant impact on rural crime in particular, especially if cuts are made or funding diverted away from rural into urban areas?
My honourable friend and neighbouring MP makes a very, very valid point, and £3.7 million is the equivalent of about 67 police officers. And this is a recurring expense, not a one-off expense. So in places like Devon and Cornwall, they will face a £6.3 million tax bill each year. Greater Manchester will be hit with a whopping extra £11.9 million tax bill each year. These are just a few examples, Chair. The list does go on. I will indeed give way.
Thank
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm really grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. The estimated cost for the West Midlands is in the region of £12.8 million. It's a huge amount of money. Does she agree with me, though, that the thing about this government they don't seem to understand is when you put the pressure of national insurance onto, say, businesses, you can't squeeze and squeeze profit margins. In the end, it goes on. It will impact upon employment, training, etc. When it comes to the public sector, again, if you keep squeezing and squeezing, that money has to come from somewhere. So does that mean reduced public services, fewer, in this case, police officers, or is the burden going to come back on the taxpayer?
Well, I think you might have hit on a point there. The burden could well come back on to the taxpayer. But remember, it is tax. It is money that will be going on tax. A bill put on by the government. It means, however you look at it, it is deprived from the front line. It will be deprived from the police service. So let's consider the financial burden that these changes will place on the police force. Employers' national insurance contribution is a significant cost for all of us, but for the police, this will be especially hard-hitting. For police forces who employ a number of police officers, staff, to protect our communities, the cumulative cost of this increase will run well into the tens of millions of pounds. To put this into perspective, Madam Chair, take West Yorkshire, where my, honourable friend was talking about. That 11.2 million per year is the equivalent to 220 police officers. 220 police officers. That will be potentially fewer police officers keeping our community safe as a direct result of this government's budget. I will name a few other places. Merseyside, my home area of Merseyside. Thank you very much indeed. They will be paying an extra tax bill a year of £7 million. That's roughly about 130 police officers. Kent, over 6 million. That's about 100 police officers a year. And Thames Valley Police will face an £8 million tax bill a year. I will indeed.
Give way. She's making a very entertaining speech, as is often the case. But I would, in the midst of all these words about tax, I would merely point out that after her party's 2 unfunded national insurance tax cuts, after a £22 billion black hole based upon unfunded spending pledges and kicking the can down the road, what is the Right Honourable Lady's suggestion for how to fill that devastating black hole that affects our constituents? Is it to be more austerity? Is it to be an increase in borrowing, or is it other tax rises? Because ultimately, this government, like any government, has to deal with a crisis such as a £22 billion black hole.
I think I need to pull the honourable gentleman up straight away. This is not in any way an entertaining speech. I would put this under a horror speech. This is a disgrace of monumental proportions. So the word entertainment was absolutely incorrectly used. But let me talk about the choices different governments have made and where money could have been saved. And that was things like GB Energy, which the new government thought it could find money for, couldn't find money for the pensioners, couldn't find money for the farmers. And by the way, this government is giving away £500 million a year to farmers overseas, but it can't find that £500 million here. So where we would stop that money is things like GB Energy, which doesn't produce any energy. It seems to be like another quango that will costing money. Foreign aid we would not have increased. And I'll tell you one thing we would not have done, collapsed to the rail unions, collapse to them, find money for those railway workers without any modernisation whatsoever. So there's a big list of things we wouldn't have been paying for. And I will not take another intervention because I can't quite get over the word entertainment in such a devastating speech, which will have devastating impacts on the streets of all of our communities. Now, there is a real risk that we will have to, or the police forces will have to scale back on recruitment, not entertaining. There is a real impact that these police forces will have to cut back on vital training, not entertaining, or reduce operational spending in other areas of the police force, again, not entertaining. These decisions could have serious consequences for the police service's ability to deliver an effective police force. The planned increases will also make it for police forces, I reckon, to recruit new officers, particularly in areas where the cost of living is already high. The government has committed to recruiting more officers, and yet these recruits will be undermined now by these fiscal pressures through taxation. So a common theme of this government, Madam Chair, is their lack of foresight. They failed to consult with backbenchers, with public services, with other government departments before steamrolling ahead with such policies. They failed to understand the impact of the rise in employers' national insurance costs on our public services, a mistake so basic it is sometimes hard to comprehend. Because we saw, I think we'll all remember this, an immediate outcry from GPs, from charities, from social care providers and from hospices. I remember being in the main chamber when the Secretary of State for Health came to the floor to answer questions on this, and he was taken aback. He didn't know how to answer it, and his plea to the Chancellor at the time is, where are we going to get that extra money? I hope I'll get that extra money, and I'll come back to you later with answers. I will indeed give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Does she agree with me that the government must know that this is causing damage to the police's ability to operate? It knows it's causing damage to the public sector. That's why it's exempted the NHS. But it has failed to exempt other public sector services like the police. So it cannot pretend this isn't causing damage.
My honourable friend is correct. And that's why I highlighted that day on the floor of the House with the Secretary of State of Health there, who was absolutely taken aback on the cost implications. And there was muttering amongst the front bench. And I think straight away they put in a solution there, but they overlooked the police. And, you know, I will come on to that later with the fact that they now think they will put money into this. So fewer police, Madam Chair, will inevitably have broader consequences for public safety. Police officers on the front lines tackling serious and organised crime, addressing domestic violence and responding to emergencies. Every officer we lose or fail to recruit means less protection for communities like Tatton. Let me give you an example. Currently, in Cheshire, there has been a significant rise in serious sexual assaults by people who are illegally in this country. So money that should have gone into supporting our police force and to halting that crime won't be there. That is making our streets less safe. I will say this government is fiscally illiterate. It made a £25 billion grab in employers' national insurance contribution at the budget, not really thinking where it would come from. Remember, the government had said, we don't want to tax working people, yet we know this is going to hit working people. So they never thought where it was going to come from. Instead, it was born out of ideological reasons, ideological purposes, whether it was funding the government's net zero obsession, foreign aid, or appeasing union paymasters. Yet in doing so, Madam Chair, this government has failed to consider the most basic duty of any government, and that is to protect its citizens. Protect its citizens. I'm afraid I won't. Now, I understand that the government says it will pick up this £230 million tab. This still means that the government will be paying a tax bill rather than having money to pay on frontline police. So whilst we heard last month the Home Secretary announced £200 million boost to neighbourhood policing to fund the recruitment of 13,000 new neighbourhood police officers, something that they'd said pre-election, and that went very quiet for a long period of time. But I just wonder, can this government do that? The numbers are very, very similar, aren't they? 200 million for 13,000 new neighbourhood police officers, and yet it's given itself 230 million a year in a tax bill. So will these 3,000 neighbourhood police officers ever materialise? Can the Minister, in her summing up, answer what will happen there, particularly in the light of this national insurance contribution black hole? And as the national insurance contribution is to be paid year in, year out, will this government be paying this year in, year out to those police forces? If so, what will that amount be for a whole Parliament, and where is that money to come from? So I urge the government and the Chancellor, through the Minister who's here today, to stop this ill-thought-through budget change, this ham-fisted change to employers' national insurance contribution. And the only solution to this problem... Well, can I finish the sentence? Yeah. There is only one solution to this problem, which will have the correct consequences, and that is to scrap the diabolical tax on our police forces. I will indeed give way.
Thank you, Dr. Alan Khan. I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for giving way. I just want to say two quick things. The reason why I went here at the beginning was my grandmother was born and raised in Birkenhead, so there is some common heritage there. And secondly, the Right Honourable Lady just said that some members of this side of the House are driven by ideology. I want it to be noted that I'm driven by love of country, and in this particular context, driven by being tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime, and I thought it was important to just provide that clarification for the House.
I want to thank the Honourable Member for saying that. I hope he too shares my delight that Liverpool is top of the football division as well. And we all should share a love of this country. We should all want the best for this country. And I too want a safe country. And therefore it is vital that the money goes to the police and the police forces to make sure that happens, and not in increased tax bills. And that's why I'm asking for this ham-fisted tax increase to be reversed. Thank you.
If they wish to be called in the debate. The question is that this House has considered the impact of planned changes to employer national insurance contributions on police forces. I call Wendy Morton.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, the member for Tatton, for securing this important debate today. She has recently highlighted the really significant increase in costs to police forces resulting from the government's decision to raise employer national insurance contributions. But I'd just like to begin by expressing my sincere thanks to our local neighbourhood police teams for their dedicated work in supporting the communities across my Aldridge Brown Hills constituency. They protect the public, they help tackle crime at the grassroots level, and they often go way above and beyond. Now, turning back to today's debate and the impact of the increased employer national insurance contributions on police forces. Now, I will refrain, tempting though it is, from delving into the decision by the Labour Police and Crime Commissioner to close and sell off the police station in Aldridge. But I want to make it clear to my constituents that I will continue to stand up for them and for our share of policing resources. Now, according to the HMRC impact assessment, the government's changes, I would actually call them the government's choice, to make the changes to employer national insurance contributions will affect approximately 1.2 million employers. And as we've heard today, that includes police authorities. For the West Midlands specifically, this policy choice, because let's remember that is what it is, it's my understanding that these changes will cost a staggering £12.8 million. That's £12.8 million that should be spent on frontline policing, in my view, especially if this government is genuinely serious about tackling crime. Now, if an average officer's wage is, say, £35,000, by my calculations, this could fund the equivalent of an additional 365 officers, and that's just in one policing authority alone, the West Midlands. Last week, I raised this issue with the Home Office Minister in the Chamber, particularly as she seemed a little unaware of the cost, and I was left unclear about its local impact. So today I'd like to ask the Honourable Lady if she can confirm whether the funds awarded to police authorities for the upcoming financial year to cover increased national insurance costs will be added to base budgets, or if this is a one-off grant. In addition, has the new funding for the 13,000 neighbourhood police officers promised in the Labour Party manifesto taken into account the additional burden of national insurance increases from April? And then with regards to policing numbers, as a constituency, unlike some of my rural colleagues, I'm on the periphery of the West Midlands, so not entirely rural, but not exactly urban either. But we often find ourselves, similarly, competing for resources with Birmingham and to some extent Walsall. So I'd be grateful today for clarification on the 13,000 additional officers promised in that Labour Party manifesto, with the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner describing these as being funded by a neighbourhood policing grant. Can the Minister confirm how long the Home Office has budgeted for these additional officers? Or will individual forces need to precept the ongoing costs? Because it's not just this year, it's looking to the future as well. So I will conclude now by just saying, Madam Chairman, that we need clarity and we need answers. My constituents need reassurance that they will not be left facing the consequences of yet another poorly thought out Labour policy or a broken manifesto promise.
I thank you, Dr. Alan Khan, for allowing me to speak in this very important debate, and I think it's good to have an opportunity to air some of these ideas. I'll just point out to the Right Honourable Member for Tatton, I was actually seeking to pay her a compliment about her oratorical style. And of course, these issues are not entertaining, but I actually find her oratory powerful, although I think the content is in this case wrong. And I would say that this government has secured a £1.1 billion funding boost for policing. It's a real terms increase in the settlement on what the previous Conservative government would have provided of 4.1% in real terms, and a cash increase of 6.6%. And this is a significant increase in funding, and it will enable this government to provide the additional officers and support to our police forces that will enable us to take back control of those streets from the criminals. And I would merely conclude by saying that law and order is not an issue which any one particular party has monopoly on. We on this side, and I think across the entire House, care greatly about giving our police officers leadership and rank and file officers who I meet, as I'm sure the Right Honourable Lady does in her area regularly. I meet with them, we want to support them, and we are doing so with this new Labour government.
One moment, think you finished.
I've finished.
That's fine.
But you're welcome to speak, I'm sure.
I now call Ben Maguire.
Thank you, Dr. Alan Khan. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the honourable member for Tatton in securing this very important debate. Also join the honourable member for Aldridge Brownhill in thanking my local police force for all of the excellent work that they do and the collaboration that they show working with myself. For years now, thanks to the last Conservative government, policing in this country has been underfunded, undermined and increasingly overstretched. This new Labour government claims it's putting more money into frontline policing, but the reality on the ground appears completely different. Across the country, forces are battling severe funding pressures, and in Devon and Cornwall, we've already seen police relying on second home council tax increases just to plug those financial gaps. The honourable member for Tatton has already pointed out that the increased costs for the Devon and Cornwall force is around 6.3 million in increased costs. Now, with the rise in employer national insurance contributions, there's a real risk that forces will face yet more impossible choices come April. They'll have to cut officer numbers or pass the bill on to local taxpayers. The £230 million allocated in the police grant report is supposed to cover this national insurance rise, yet once the broader budget is examined, the reality is clear. Factoring in the reliance on council tax precepts, the government's so-called increase in police funding is only around £426 million of actual new cash versus the headline figure of £986 million. It's simply not enough to ensure safe and effective policing across the country. Forces are already stretched to breaking point, with officers unable to focus on crimes that matter most to all of our communities. As per Home Office figures, 6,000 cases are closed daily without a suspect being identified, and 3 in every 4 burglaries and car thefts go unsolved. Yet instead of fixing these underlying problems, the government's adding new financial burdens on forces that will inevitably mean fewer officers on our streets. And in rural constituencies like mine of North Cornwall, rural crime is up 4.3% year on year, while criminal gangs are targeting farmyards and villages. The theft of agricultural equipment, including GPS systems, has spiked by 137%, yet just 0.1% of police officers are dedicated to tackling rural crime. For my constituents and those of other honourable members here today, this is simply nothing but shameful. The rise in national insurance will only make this problem worse, forcing already strained rural policing teams to spread their resources even thinner. And the police grant report doesn't directly mention rural crime once. I fear this tells my constituents and constituents of other honourable members representing rural areas everything they need to know about where the government's priorities lie. But we need to think bigger than this. If the government truly want to invest in frontline policing, it would scrap the failing police and crime commissioner system, which drains millions that could be spent on actual frontline policing. Our very own Devon and Cornwall PCC is already on her 3rd Chief Constable and her 2nd Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner. We need to fund officers, not office administrators. And let's not forget the wider impact of the national insurance increase on our public services. The Liberal Democrats have opposed this hike from the beginning, calling for GPs, firefighters, hospices, care providers, NHS dentists to be exempted from the rise. St Petrock's Doctor's Surgery in St Column in my North Cornwall constituency told me just last Friday that they're facing a bill of £180,000 in national insurance rises and increased wages. It's completely counterproductive to increase funding on one hand for vital services like healthcare while taxing them more at the same time. The exact same principles apply here to the police. If the government refuses to cancel this damaging rise, then at the very least they should exempt policing from these additional costs. For years, forces across the country have struggled to deliver neighbourhood policing that our communities so expect and deserve. The national insurance increase threatens to take yet more money away from those who need it the most, and our frontline officers and bobbies on the beat. So I conclude by asking the Minister today, will the government commit to properly funding frontline policing without relying on council tax increases? Will they support my calls for a dedicated rural crime task force so that rural communities like mine are not left behind? And if they do insist on pushing through this flawed national insurance rise, will they at least protect essential services like policing from its worst impacts? If we're really serious about making our streets safer, we need more officers on the street, not higher costs that risk endangering us all. Thank you.
Opposition spokesperson Matt Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank you, Madam Chair, for chairing this debate today, and also the Honourable Member for Tatton for bringing this important debate today and all the work she has done in raising awareness of this issue and its consequences. The last government recruited 20,000 more police officers, ensuring there were more police officers on our streets than ever before. Why would anyone think that the solution to any problem would be a tax raid on our police forces? Any MP who's engaged their PCC or Chief Constable knows that the funding settlement put forward for local police forces by this government is entirely inadequate. Just the other week, when questioned by Nick Robinson about the absurd tax rate on local police forces and the fact that the police funding settlement will cut the number of police on our streets, the Minister conceded that she was not going to pretend it's not challenging for police forces. Since then, the government have painted a different picture, understating the impact it could have on our police forces and on police numbers. At first glance, the settlement may appear generous in cash terms. However, there's a sleight of hand. The government is claiming to have increased police funding by £1.09 billion, masking their tax rate on our police forces and their failure to build police pay awards into the baseline. The previous Conservative government provided in-year funding for PCCs to cover the police pay award, adding this to the baseline for subsequent years. By contrast, the in-year adjustment for this year's pay settlement was not added to the baseline, and so about £200 million of the apparent increase this year simply makes up for that omission. Furthermore, as members have raised, some £230 million of this apparently generous settlement will go straight back to the Treasury to pay for the government's own national insurance tax rate on our local police forces. The government is literally taxing the police off our streets. So around £430 million of this apparently generous increase actually just makes up for the government's own choices. Adjusting for that, the increase in funding for policing next year is not £1.09 billion at all, but more like £660 million, nearly £300 million less than the last increase under the previous government. Make no mistake, this tax raid on local police forces, created by our own government, will have real consequences for communities across England and Wales. There are estimates that the shortfall in police funding could see 1,800 fewer police on our streets. Take my own force of Cleveland, a force already placed under special measures and with a recent report from HMIC giving Cleveland Police an inadequate rating for responding to children at risk of harm and for investigating child abuse, neglect and exploitation. It's deeply concerning and entirely unacceptable that vulnerable young people are being let down in such a way. Protecting children should be a priority for the Labour government and Cleveland's Labour Police Commissioner. These children deserve better. Does the Minister agree that creating a shortfall in funding for a force could lead to more failures in responding to and investigating child abuse, neglect and exploitation in Cleveland? Go for it. Yeah.
I'm very grateful to Chair the Minister. He knows I'm a reasonable man, so I'm not going to engage in partisan games for the fun of it. But I just want to draw him back to what he said at the beginning of, not all the time anyway. I just want to drag him back to what he just said at the outset of it. He used the word inadequate to describe the settlement. So can I just confirm that if he'd been police minister, the settlement would have been higher? And if so, how would that have been paid for?
Years, as you've seen in previous years, we were increasing the funding by more. In fact, last year we increased it by £300 million more than you are this year. We weren't raiding our police forces with national insurance tax raids. We were putting that pay award into the baseline. I would be wasting less money on GB Energy. I would be wasting less money on, well, I would not be looking to give train drivers on £55,000 a year a bumper pay rise of almost £10,000 with no efforts to increase productivity. It's about priorities. For the Conservative government, policing was a priority. That's why 20,000 more were put on the streets. That is why there were record numbers on our police like never before. I know the government's pointed to its promise to recruit 13,000 new neighbourhood police officers. But as we all know, this only includes a relatively small number. Just 3,000 of these are new officers. Most of the claimed 13,000 are either being reassigned or redeployed, are part-time volunteers or are PCSOs with no powers of arrest. This redeployment is concerning for many. Can the Minister assure MPs here today that when their constituents ring 999, they won't have to wait longer for an emergency response because response officers have been redeployed to neighbourhoods? Can she also guarantee that police numbers will not fall any lower than the current level as a result of her funding settlement? Given the nature of modern policing and overtime, to what extent did the government consider the impact of overtime on the increased national insurance costs, and do they believe there could be a further shortfall as a result? We owe a huge debt of gratitude to our brave, hard-working police officers, PCSOs and police staff. They deserve resources and support, not tax raids and funding shortfalls. Thank you.
Minister Dame Diana Johnson.
It's a pleasure to serve under you this afternoon, Dr Alan Khan. Let me begin, of course, by thanking the Right Honourable Member for Tatton for securing this debate. And I actually agree with my honourable friend for Rugby. I think the Right Honourable Lady has a very engaging style in her skills of oratory. However, I don't agree with what she's actually saying, but I think she has a very engaging and enjoyable style of communication. So I think we should take that as a compliment. Let me begin as well by also thanking the other honourable members who've spoken this afternoon in the Chamber. The Honourable Member for Chester South and Edisbury, another Cheshire MP, the Right Honourable Lady for Aldbridge Brown Hills, who at the start of her contribution recognised the very valuable role of neighbourhood policing in her area. I think the Honourable Member for the Isle of Wight intervened as well, and the Honourable Member for North Cornwall, who speaks on behalf of the Liberal Democrats. And I was rather intrigued because I'm old enough in the tooth to remember when the Liberal Democrats and their Liberal Democrat ministers in the coalition government were actively arguing for PCCs and putting them on the statute books back in the 2010 to 2015 Parliament when I was a member then. But I also heard his comments on rural crime, and I know that's an issue that a number of members are very concerned about. And then my honourable friend, the member for Rugby, who set out very clearly, actually, this government's commitment to policing and the police settlement that was announced and finalised last month. So I also want to take just a moment to express my gratitude to each and every police officer, staff member and volunteer who works tirelessly, often in the most difficult circumstances, to keep our communities safe. And this government recognises the invaluable contribution that they make and the need to ensure policing is properly funded and protected. The challenges police personnel face are very real, and it is essential that they are equipped and resourced to do their jobs effectively. And the resourcing of police forces is quite understandably a subject of considerable interest for parliamentarians and the public. And discussions that help shine a light on these important issues, such as the one that we're having this afternoon, are, I think, to be welcomed. Now, in a moment, I will turn to the specific focus of the debate on national insurance contributions. But in the interest of providing some important context and background, I will refer briefly to that police funding settlement that was put before the House in January. The settlement for 25-26 provides an increase of up to £1.1 billion to policing, taking the government's total investment to £19.6 billion. And we have listened to the police, and we do know the challenges that they face. And I would say gently to members opposite who perhaps served in previous Conservative governments, there is quite a history of how the Conservatives funded or didn't fund policing. And I know the Shadow Minister takes great delight about talking about the additional police officers towards the end of the Conservative time in office, but he also needs to remember the huge cuts that happened to policing. Over 20,000 police officers lost, thousand upon thousand of police staff lost in the years of austerity and the cuts that the Conservative governments brought forward. I'm very happy to.
I thank my right honourable friend. Would she agree with me that if you cut police officers by 20,000 and then you replace them by an additional 20,000. You haven't really done a huge amount to boost police numbers.
My honourable friend makes a very important point, and I think what I'm also very conscious about is the loss of the experienced officers out of that 20,000. And we know now that the service is very young. I think it's about 40% are under 5 years service, and that presents all sorts of challenges for policing. So just returning to setting the scene here, I want to make it very clear that we have increased the funding available for neighbourhood policing by an additional 100 million, and that was compared to the provisional settlement that was announced at the end of last year. So we will now be putting into neighbourhood policing, I think something we can all agree in this chamber is so important to our constituents. That figure will now be at 200 million. And that investment is to kickstart the delivery of the 13,000 neighbourhood police officers, PCSOs and specials that the Labour government did promise in its manifesto, and also ensure that the public confidence in policing is restored. And as I said when opening the debate on the police grant report last week in the Chamber, the settlement underlines this government's commitment to working with the police to deliver the safer streets that all our constituents deserve. And I also think it's worth just saying that I spoke to the PCC in Cheshire last week about the funding settlement, and he was actually positive about that funding settlement that had been announced for his force. He didn't raise any specific issues on national insurance, and in fact it's worth reflecting on the fact that the force did not raise any concerns in the consultation on the provisional settlement after that was published in December. Now, turning to the issue of national insurance contributions, yes, of course.
Did the Right Honourable Lady receive a further letter from the Chief Constable seriously concerned about the extra or rising number of serious sexual assaults that was going on in Cheshire and his serious concerns about that?
As I've said in the comments I've just made, the PCC who I spoke to last week did not raise any concerns about the financial settlement. Obviously, for the PCC and the Chief Constable, they use that money in the way that they decide for Cheshire. I certainly have had conversations with the Chief Constable of Cheshire, and the Right Honourable Lady is right. I have received a letter from the Chief Constable, which I think was copied to a number of members of Parliament in Cheshire. Just now, returning to this issue about the changes to the national insurance contributions, I do accept and recognise that it will have, of course, an impact on public sector budgets, including policing. And while the decision to increase national insurance was made to ensure the sustainability of essential public services, I recognise that those changes do create additional cost pressures for police forces. I think it's also worth just reflecting at this point and useful to note that, of course, in 2003 and in 2011, again under the coalition governments actually, there was an increase in employer national insurance, and that was to fund the National Health Service and the wider national priorities. So this is not unusual. Governments of both complexions have taken forward changes to national insurance. And also it's worth just noting that the changes that were introduced in the budget last year broadly return national insurance contributions revenue as a proportion of GDP to the level that they were before the previous government's cuts to employee and self-employed NIC's national insurance contributions. So just to set that into context, and it's been done in a way that does not result in higher taxes in people's pay slips. And we've also set aside funding. Yes, happy to.
When the Right Honourable Lady says that this won't impact on employees' pay slips, I think she completely misses the point here, which is that whether it's a business or whether it's public sector, if you keep squeezing and squeezing, you can't just do that expecting things to continue as they are. If it's a business, you squeeze them out of business. There are no jobs. There will be no pay packet. If you keep squeezing the public sector, there will be no public services.
Well, with the greatest of respect to the Right Honourable Lady, who I think was the Chief Whip under the disastrous premiership of Liz Truss, I am not really prepared to take lessons on economic stability and how to run the economy from a government that trashed the economy, that caused such devastation to many families because of the rise in interest rates and mortgages. So I think perhaps a little humility might be in order. I also want to just say as well that we have set aside funding to protect the spending power of the public sector, including the NHS, from these direct impacts of the increase in employer national insurance changes. And that is why we are providing compensation of £230.3 million to support forces with the cost of changes to national insurance and ensure that no force is left out of pocket as a result. And the Right Honourable may like to know that this is similar, actually, to the funding provided by the previous government in the 24-25 police funding settlement to cover the additional costs then of pension changes. So again, this is not unusual. Now, the Right Honourable Lady may have concerns about the £3.7 million pressure reported by her local police force as a result of those changes, and the impact that this could have on officer numbers. As set out in the settlement papers, though, we are fully covering those costs, and actually for Cheshire, they're getting £3.9 million in national insurance compensation for next year, so more than they actually anticipated they would need. Now, this is alongside, of course, the £200 million that we are investing in neighbourhood policing to ensure that not only are officer numbers maintained, but that visible policing in our communities increases. Our mission is clear, and the funding provided in this settlement will ensure that forces across the country are equipped to meet the challenges that they face and protect our communities. I do, of course, as I've said a number of times this afternoon, recognise that any additional pressures on forces are concerning. And this is why we will continue to engage closely with forces and finance leads to ensure policing has the resources it needs. Before I finish, I just want to again thank the Right Honourable Member for securing this debate and for all those who have spoken. We are compensating for the national insurance increases to ensure forces have the resources they need to protect visible neighbourhood policing. Our position could not be clearer. We will work in lockstep with the law enforcement system in our shared effort to keep people safe, whether that involves restoring and protecting the long-standing tradition of British policing, such as neighbourhood policing, or acting to combat the most dangerous emerging threats. This government is wholly committed to providing the police with the powers, the resources and the tools that they need to protect the public.
Esther McVeigh to wind up.
I want to thank all members for taking part in today's debate. I think I understood from everyone that they wouldn't want to see police officers taxed off our streets. And one thing, though, I don't think I got consensus on, or at least, and that's why I say the current government is fiscally illiterate. What they didn't seem to understand is that money going to pay for extra taxes means that is money that won't be going on the front line. The very fact it is going in taxes and it has got to be compensated for taxes says it is not going to go on the front line. And that is why I'm asking for this policy to be stopped and to be reversed. And something else, a bit of a collective amnesia from the opposite benches. The coalition government came into power because the previous Labour government pretty much crashed the economy. That is why the coalition was voted in, and I have to say, I already see in 7 months that this Labour government, with that awful budget, is doing exactly the same thing. It is crashing the economy all over again, but in record time of 6 months. I just want to make sure that our police are protected, the streets are protected, and I do want to thank the Minister, because I know she takes it very seriously, and I do know whatever she does or doesn't say on the floor here today, I know she will be taking that message back, and I know she will be fighting to get that terrible employers' national insurance contribution policy reversed.
The question is that this House has considered the impact of planned changes to employer national insurance contributions on police forces. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.